Hi everyone, it's Midnight Outcry once more. I'm going to share 10 horrifying true tales about Kentucky's haunted houses with you today. You will reconsider spending the night in any Kentucky rural area after reading these stories. But before we begin, I would really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and tell your friends about this. Tell me where you're sitting, please. Please accept my sincere appreciation. Let me start now. Fact 1. At the time, I was 31 years old. At that time, I got a letter out of the blue. I had an aunt named Geneva, but I didn't know it. The house she left me was on a little country road in rural Kentucky. It was hidden behind a wrought iron fence, shrouded in what looked like vegetation and rust. The envelope contained the old yellow deed. The key was affixed to a sheet of handwritten line paper. "You are welcome to join. It is not allowed to stay overnight." I slipped it into my jacket. I should have hesitated, but I did not. I was in a bad mood. I'm delivering groceries to make ends meet after going through a divorce. Sleeping on a friend's rickety pull-out couch, which seemed to hate sleep. Because of this, the thought of owning a home, that is, not having to pay rent or a mortgage, seemed like a strange and tragic blessing. There were no neighbors within miles of my property. It was just the dirt road, the universe, and me. It didn't appear to be haunted when I first drove up. It looked as though it had been fighting for decades to stay upright in the face of rain and cold on its 3 floors. It was tall and rebellious. The porch was sagging. There was a brass plate with the words Geneva in almost tattered lettering, and a keyhole in place of a doorknob. I turned the key and went ahead. Before the door swung wide, it felt like the house had been anxiously awaiting me. Like an old trunk you nearly threw out, the interior was filled with cedar and a musty, ancient smell. The wood floors, surprisingly, looked to be in good shape. The house, with its heavy curtains that obscured the windows, seemed to feel the same way. Both the water mains and the electrical power are out. Even the sound of your own footsteps could be heard due to the dust, mildew in the corners, and the eerily quiet atmosphere, indicating that the building was sound. That first night, I lay in the parlor on my sleeping bag and listened. In rural areas, quiet does not equate to tranquility. It's thick. The sounds it lets in are astounding. The outside of the house is surrounded by shifting boards, wind rustling through cracks, and occasional tapping that sounds like branches. Probably not much, I told myself. On the second night, I went upstairs. There are 5 bedrooms, most of which are still furnished. I picked one with a canopy bed, even though I hate canopies. I found a closet and smelled a faint perfumed mothball scent. I found a nightstand in the hall and put an oil light on it. The light flickered, but did not go out. I became conscious of my surroundings for the first time at 2:45 in the morning. Nothing woke me up. No, it was entirely wrong. It felt like I had woken up from a dream, and the world was too big and cold. No light was present. The closet door was open. I didn't touch it. I persuaded myself that it was loose and that it opened by itself. I fastened it and looked for drafts, and it is airtight. 10 minutes later, I woke up again. The door stood open. I hadn't closed it before. On the 3rd night, I started having trouble falling asleep. I grabbed a flashlight and went to look into it. You might have foreseen the state of the basement. There were shelves filled with containers of unidentified substances, musty doors, and stone walls. I rushed forward. I went to the attic next. The door resisted me like the last line of defense in the house, even though it wasn't locked. It opened, and I felt a rush of warmth. It was not hot, but rather as though someone had just left. The gray sheet covering the mirror seemed to be breathing as I walked up to it. I did it. The reflection did not match the spotless, recently washed surface of the mirror. Through the window, the attic grew deeper and darker. Later, I caught a glimpse of my smiling reflection in the mirror, surrounded by oddly warped corners and bent rafters. I spun around. Utterly abandoned, I turned to see my reflection, and the room was empty. I covered it and left. That morning, I blamed it on worry. Somehow, I went shopping and bought a generator, canned food, and a new lock. For at least one more night, I decided to stay up. That night, The house didn't waste any time. At exactly 3 in the morning, the electricity flickered and then went out. My flashlight seemed to have suffered a heart attack. The darkness engulfed me. I grabbed her oil light. It was gone. The door was open. Through the gaps came a small bluish light, possibly the moon. When I saw them, everything changed. Images of people. They had never been in the region before. Everybody wore pale, old-fashioned clothes, men and children alike. Expressionless faces, either during a grieving process or during a conversation. Eye colors that are out of harmony. Some are missing, some are too big. Their mouths open slightly, as though they were still whispering for help. My bare feet felt the damp ground. I turned around. The corridor was empty except for darkness. I ran to the parlor. The curtains were gone. Every window had a spooky, dark emptiness. The front door had smooth wood instead of a handle. In the corner, the mirror was once again visible. My eyes didn't move. My reflection did not move until it opened its eyes. A smile appeared on its face. The arrow was pointed. I turned around. The portrait was smiling behind me. I ended up back in the attic somehow. The mirror showed optical reflections. The reflection was moved by someone. I turned around and saw, at least through the window, that the attic door had opened. This is my 2-step procedure. Yes, I am. Without hesitation, without blinking. Came over to me gently. I staggered back, screaming. Then the real attic door creaked open. I forgot about it. I ran. The hallways curved. The ceiling was now covered in upside-down portraits of smiling people. The entrance door led to the same hallway rather than out. The same images. You sane me at last. I fainted in the kitchen. I begged. I promised to leave. Then came slow, deliberate, patient steps up. I grabbed a kitchen knife in my rush to get to the cellar. There was a knock on the door. On the bookcases, dishes jangled. One fell and broke. There was a human tooth in it. Hair, nail, bone, and another container fell to the ground. I don't want to remember what happened next. I repeatedly knocked on the door until it gave way. Calm and quiet. I ran during the day. I kept going until I reached a road. I was dropped off at a diner 10 miles away by a truck driver. I left everything I owned. Second story. At the age of 22, I received a phone call from my cousin Darren. He wanted to know if I could help him beautify the house he had purchased in rural Kentucky, about 40 minutes from any type of town. He said he bought it at an estate sale for a pittance, told me it needed only a little loving care and was in good condition. Exactly what he said. He intended to move in and rent out his old apartment after we spent a week cleaning and repairing the exterior. His excitement was infectious, as though he had unearthed a long-lost gem. He was the kind of person who saw opportunities where others saw only issues. I said, sure. I could see why the price was so cheap as soon as I turned off the paved road and entered the lengthy sandy lane. I had intended to take it easy during that week. The place was empty. Alone, I would say. It was a long, winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever until it ended at a rundown 2-story farmhouse in the middle of a huge, empty pasture. There were no mailboxes, signs, or streetlights. The paint was peeling and fading white, and there were big bald spots where the wood had turned gray. In one place, a long veranda sagged. The windows were all tightly closed and so black that it seemed the building had eyes. With the possible exception of a far-off roofline, there were no houses in either direction. It might have been a neighbor by chance. There might have been a barn. Darren was waiting for me when I got there. He was working, tossing rotting wood and broken chairs into a pile by the porch steps. Wearing work gloves and grinning broadly, he waved as if he were part of a home improvement montage. From the inside, the house appeared to be no different from any other long-abandoned building. The first thing I noticed was the musty, dry air, which was as thick and still as a storage unit that had been there for decades. The walls were covered in yellowing patches and fading floral wallpaper with curled corners. There was a creak as one walked on the wood floors. They seemed to be warning us, but not in a charming, antiques-filled way. We started the climb. We should start on the top floor and work our way down, according to Darren. The bedrooms were crammed with shabby, useless furniture. Chipped dressers, submerged mattresses, dim lights with frayed shades. Things that someone's great-grandmother may have accumulated for too long. One small room caught my attention. It appeared even more cramped due to the slanted ceilings and one tiny window. A tall, slim dresser, almost black in color, with a mirror attached to the top, sat on the opposite wall. The oval mirror had a long crack across the upper left corner. The dull green color had crept into the rusted brass frame. Something about it seemed heavy and confused, as though it didn't belong in the room or in the house. As Darren noted, there was a note about the dresser in the auction documents. It was supposed to remain with the property. He laughed and shrugged, saying it was all part of the house's charm. The phrase struck me as odd, but since we were buried in dirty sheets and trash bags, I chose to ignore it. While I was sorting clothes, I noticed something odd about the mirror. My reflection seemed to be off each time I passed it. My arms and whatever I was holding looked light and fuzzy, as though I were dealing with a malfunctioning video feed where part of the image didn't load. But my head and chest looked normal and fine. Several times my shape looked crooked, like it had been sketched with shaky lines. Sometimes there was no impact at all. I told myself it was just warped or dirty glass. According to what I understand, old mirrors can do that. Ultimately, we worked until the grassland sun sank. Because there were no overhead lights, it quickly grew very dark. Absence of insulation, air conditioning, and heating. We all went upstairs to our rooms and hunkered down because Darren had packed a lot of blankets. I was startled out of my reverie by the sound of approaching footsteps. Not below, nor outside. Right outside my front door in the hallway. Slowly, almost purposefully, they moved. Not like when you're half asleep and pacing or stumbling around. They passed my door once more after a minute, and then they vanished. After waiting for a short while, I got up. The hallway was empty. As if I were in the quiet before a storm, I could feel the air getting heavier and thicker because there were no outside distractions. Only the sound of running water and the creaks beneath my feet. I was unable to open Darren's door. From inside came a soft snore. I went back to my room and locked myself in by pressing the doorbell. As soon as the latch was in place, the footsteps resumed their previous rhythm, pausing between each stride. "Don't open the door for me anymore." I felt sleepy the next morning, but I said nothing. Darren continued talking about taking out the old kitchen cabinets as though nothing had happened. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe my mind was racing because of the uncanny silence in the house. Later that day, I went upstairs to get a toolbox. I automatically looked in the mirror as I passed the small bedroom. And then I saw it. I could see the outline of a tall, thin, still figure in the hallway behind me. In the mirror's image, this figure was merely a shape with no distinguishing characteristics. But I knew immediately that it was not Darren. I nearly tripped over my quick reversal. The hallway was empty. I saw myself in the mirror once more. I didn't have any reservations. I hurried downstairs to let Darren know that we needed to move the dresser. His skepticism gave me the impression that he was about to mock me. We took it outside and leaned it against the porch railing after he laughed and said, "All right, if it's frightening you that much." It was so heavy that it appeared hesitant to be moved. We slept on sleeping bags in the living room during the night, moved closer to the car, and kept the equipment handy. Neither of us gave a clear explanation when asked why we didn't want to sleep upstairs once more. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of timber shifting, which was not the same as a normal stream sharpening. I stood up straight and looked in the direction of the door. It was a fairly open space. The outside was dark. Darren slept soundly on my side. I grabbed the flashlight as I was heading to the porch. The dresser was gone. Lost. There was silence. Nothing dragged or broke. We got Darren up, went outside, put on our socks, and swept the beam of the flashlight across the grass. There were no footprints, no traces, and no signs at all on the porch where we had set it down. It looked like the dirt had never been trampled. We didn't talk until the sun rose. Both of us were alert. By morning, everything was packed. Breakfast was forgotten. We didn't look back as we drove off. Darren listed the house for sale that same week. Informed the new owner that he would not be able to finish the job right now. In the third story, I consented to help my friend Mason take pictures of an old farmhouse outside Clay Ridge, a tiny Kentucky hamlet. At the time, I was 27 years old. After switching jobs, I was going through an unusual period of unemployment. When he texted me to ask if I would be interested in accompanying him and helping carry gear for a couple $100s, I wasn't particularly interested. Before they begin renovations, he said, the out-of-state developer buying the house wants to see before and after pictures. It appeared simple. We ate lunch and went home after spending the afternoon at a run-down, dusty place. We left in Mason's SUV early in the morning and drove for the first hour. Then things changed. More trees, smaller roads, and less traffic. We felt as though we had driven into a time capsule when we got to Clay Ridge. A single gas station, a few rundown stores, and that's about it. The place looked frozen in the 1980s. We stopped for refreshments and asked if the property knew the cashier. He just blinked at Mason and muttered something about old property before he called us. Very good. Great start. We followed the GPS out of town and wound our way through fields that resembled overgrown yards, more than actual farms, and seemingly endless back roads. We passed derailed outbuildings, rusting tractors, and patches of woodland that nearly touched the road. The branches scratched the car in a few spots unless you stayed perfectly in your lane. I kept checking my phone's signal strength even though I had no one to text. The directions ended at a short gravel lane that was partially hidden by weeds. There was a driveway that looked like a deer trail but no fence or mailbox. When our tires scrunched over pebbles, we came to a stop. The tree limbs tapped softly against the windshield as if they were calling to us. Then the trees split apart. I did see it, yes. The house was right in the middle of a small clearing, as though it had been waiting for us. Two stories are told. Bone-white siding replaced what was once pale, possibly yellow. The roof was drooping. The porch looked flimsy enough to fall apart, but it held. A lone building stands cut off from the outside world, with no satellite dish or electrical cables in sight. After parking, I exited the vehicle. There was nobody. Eerily quiet, in contrast to rural areas where you can hear insects or the wind. The silence was deafening, as though the clearing were on mute. Mason didn't say anything. He's just opened the hatch and started drawing gear. The porch held us in spite of its moans. Mason turned the handle and the door swung open with little resistance. I was expecting dust, cobwebs and raccoon droppings inside. On the contrary, it seemed as if someone had just stepped out of the room. Maintained furniture upright and cushions clean. A coat rests on the back of the chair. In the kitchen, dishes were hung up to dry. Shoes of polished brown leather stood by the door, neatly lined up, dust-free, toes pointed outward. Not at all. Not on the mantel, baseboards, or beneath the table. There was no sense of desolation. It was as though time had stopped and the house was holding its breath. I followed Mason into the parlor and we started unloading. A large doorway led to a small staircase that curled up to the second floor. The banister was in good shape and the stair railing was intact. I went to the hall to get another bag. When I turned around, the staircase had been replaced by a white wall that had been freshly plastered and was seamless as if it had always been there. I sensed it strongly. I stepped back because my heart was pounding slowly and erratically. I called Mason over, my voice firm. His expression betrayed him as he looked at the wall and then at me before stating, "Probably just another room." I went back to the doorway. The staircase was visible even from that position, staying steady and unchanged. Going back to the parlor, the wall is the only thing left. Mason let out a half laugh. Peculiarities of the home. We started filming in the kitchen. He had his tripod ready. I forced open a cabinet to create space. Numerous packages were present, each secured with brittle string, but there were neither plates nor correspondence. Each handwritten, yellowed envelope was addressed to Evelyn Hayes. A wide range of postmarks from the 1920s to the most recent year were discovered. One even had a forever stamp on it. My chest tightened once more, as though someone had taken hold of my ribs and was pushing them upward. I carefully closed the cabinet. I propped myself up on the counter and tried to take it in. Then the sound started. 2 heavy, slow steps up, without shifting beams or cacks. Real, weighted, systematic steps. I looked up. The kitchen ceiling was incomplete in a few places. Seeming rays of light, but the sound came from the solid region where there should be nothing above it. Mason even picked it up. He remained motionless, gazing up at the ceiling. We repacked quickly and went back to the front door without saying anything to each other. I reached for it, but all I saw was another wall, cold, freshly plastered and perfectly smooth. Every door was examined. We were led from the kitchen into a strange hallway. It wound its way around, alternating between a den and the parlor. Every route led us back to our starting point. Halfway down the flight, the steps reappeared, and a woman was standing. She stayed motionless, her hands clasped at her waist. A long gray dress hung down to her ankles. Her eyes followed us without flinching. She looked calm, too calm. Mason muttered something I couldn't understand. We ran straight for her. As we passed through the air, it grew heavier, like water. My shoulder skimmed her garment. A chill and a sense of doom struck. The door was there this time. Actual. The car, the porch, and the stairs were all hit. Despite his misplaced key, Mason turned on the engine. Behind us, gravel rained down as we accelerated. Since then, that farmhouse has been abandoned. Fourth, Riven was the one who offered me the job, even though I hadn't spoken to her in years. He had gone to high school with my cousin. Although we had spent some time together in the past, mostly at bonfires and basement parties, we had never been very close. I was therefore taken aback when I got his message out of the blue. Through an old acquaintance who was assisting in the clearance of a house near Harrodsburg, he mentioned that he was aware of some side gigs. There was no involvement from the proprietors. If the unwanted items had been taken out, the property could have been sold much sooner. It sounded easy, he'd said. It's not a popular road out there. Since my rent was already past due and I needed the money, I told him I would accept it. I was desperate, but that should have told me something. I took care not to delve too far. The address and directions have now been sent to me. Without a GPS, I drove my pickup with the windows down. The static on the radio grew louder in the distance from town. When I arrived, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. As I approached, I noticed weeds brushing against the undercarriage from the dried skin-like cracks in the driveway. The house, set back from the road, was partially hidden by overgrown trees and tall grass. There are wide strands of gray paint flaking on both floors. The porch sagged to one side, as though it had given up trying to stay upright. There were no cars in sight. The committee is not welcome. There is still no sign of life, and the gate is locked. The house was the only thing there, standing still as though someone was waiting for it. The front door had developed a small crack. I switched off the engine and sat down for a while, holding on to the steering wheel. I haven't felt nervous yet. I've just been alert, experiencing the unnerving feeling that something is amiss, but you're not sure why. In any case, I went outside and climbed the stairs carefully. A few boards sighed, as though they might give way and shout, "Hey, Riven, send me!" Upstairs, everything was so quiet that not even my own breath sounded normal. Inside, the musty, warm air seemed to have remained unchanged for years. The furniture was covered with those stiff old sheets that resembled shrouds rather than covers. A few of them were missing. It stuck out at an odd angle, as if one of the chair's armrests had been dragged and left behind. Through the blinds, only a weak, narrow light was visible, barely reaching the corners. The dry smells of dust, rotting wood, and a faint metallic odor filled the air. I could see marks on the walls as I passed the living room. They looked like smudges at first, as though someone had been going around the area picking up dirt. When I looked more closely, I saw that the loops were layered, overlapping, and overly regular, as though someone had been finger tracing the same pattern over and over. I tried not to look too long, Nobody seemed to want to take too close a look inside the house. My first target was the recliner. It was heavier than I had expected, and when I dumped it, a long, uneven scratching sound echoed off the walls. Then came a half-rotten, unwieldy bookshelf. Every sound seemed too loud, as though the house were listening. As I dragged a few things to the porch, I was having trouble breathing deeply because it was already hot outside. They looked at my phone. No bars at all. I sighed and looked up. From the inside, it was locked. I didn't touch it. I walked over to the door and touched the handle. I took offense. Cold, too. It was oily and slick, as though it had been soaked in something undesirable. I quickly pulled my hand back and wiped it on my jeans. I turned around and saw a different corridor. Its course has veered to the left. I was certain of it. It now swerved to the right. I stood still for a moment, trying to understand it. The furniture never moved from its original position when I cocked my head to check if I had been turned around. The hallway was the only thing that had changed. I suppressed myself, thinking that perhaps I was clearly tired. My physical self, however, was skeptical. I felt like I was preparing for impact as my body tensed up. Still, I went back. I wasn't going home empty-handed after 2 hours of driving. On my way to the dining room, I grabbed the table. I raised one end and then stomped, looking out the window. The backyard came into view. I was the only one who knew for sure that this room had once overlooked the front yard and driveway. Now trees were on display, including the dead pines on the other side. I set the table down on the floor with care. I stopped trying to find an explanation when I realized it. It didn't add up here. It wasn't just that I was tired and nervous either. The walls shifted while I was away. The spaces changed. I finally saw the footprints. They looked dim through the dust. Bare feet, possibly those of a 6 or 7-year-old child. It's not new, but it vaguely relates to what I do. I had never seen them before. They led us into a hallway. I hadn't gone very far below. Something that had never been there before. I followed their example. They stopped at a door under the stairs. One I didn't see when I walked in. New scars from torn nails and ornamental rust on the hinges. I don't know why I ever opened it. All I did was wave my hand. A set of stairs came next. In a normal basement, on a level with a staircase. Too tight, too steep. The walls closed in on all sides like stepping into a throat. I walked slowly, feeling each board move. The air was dead and cold, as if it had never been breathed. There was a corridor at the base that was too long for the house. At the very end, a small child with a pale complexion and a white dress stood still. She stood in the shadows, silent and unmoving, as though she had been waiting. My pupils widened. She was gone. In her place was something else, humanoid in shape but twisted as though it had been cooked, and then allowed to cool at the wrong angle. Its skin had become brittle and blackened. When I should have been, there was nothing. Nothing moved. Yes, I did. I whirled around and ran. In places they had never been before, new corridors appeared. On my new to go, I fell down the steps, slammed into the wall, caught myself, and walked away. I leaped to my feet in what might have been the foyer. The front door was now blocked by a solid wall. I hammered it with my palm. The wallboard burst after first bubbling. Out of sight. Wood was engraved with the same looping symbols. Hundreds or even thousands. Some are still a little damp, while others are freshly carved. Then the knocking began. Calmly and methodically. 1, 3, 2, and 4. I didn't attend the 5th. I ran to the nearest window and leaped out. My arm was internally pierced by glass, but it didn't hurt much. I landed on a bed of splintered branches and dried grass as I rolled to my feet. I hurried outside to retrieve the truck. I had left it in the wrong place. It was facing the opposite direction, as if it had driven itself to the house. I didn't care. I jumped up and threw the key into the ignition, giving it a solid thud. The wheels turned and came to a stop. The gap between us appeared to have widened, as though the trees had moved while I was away. I didn't slow down until I got to the main road. I pulled into a gas station after 30 minutes of driving and sat there trying to catch my breath while the motor ran. Fifth story. At the age of 29, I began cleaning in Kentucky. I had been there at least 6 months. The only requirement was that a real estate agent have a house cleaned out before listing it. He didn't want to draw attention to the fact that it had been ignored for decades. He probably didn't know. I approved even before I saw the address. Decided not to ask more questions. I was receptive to the idea of anything that wasn't too dramatic at that point in my life. Pursuing what I had left behind. A dilapidated farmhouse seems like a fun place to vacuum spider webs. The house was supposed to be 40 minutes outside of Lexington, but once I got out there, it felt much farther. I proceeded past the last gas station and traffic sign, and then struck gravel that seemed intent on breaking my car. When even the gravel finally gave way, I was bouncing through grass that reached up over my knees on a path that scarcely qualified as a track, and then I saw it. The mansion sat half hidden by a hedge of trees. Once white, the 2 stories have turned gray, a sign that no one is listening. There was not a single shutter. The rest hung down as though someone had started to take them off but had given up. Not even a mailbox or driveway indicated that anyone had been there in years. I found a place in the brush and then stepped out and stood for a while, just staring. The trees seemed too motionless, unsettling, but I only had the key. The fact that the man's gift had been successful astounded me. When the lock turned, there was a horrible crunch, as though something inside was hesitant to move. As soon as you stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. No, it wasn't spoiled or awful. The air was dry. Bone is dry as well. No buzzing, no flapping of wings, not even a breeze. The kind of dead silence that gives you the impression that you entered a room just as someone else was speaking. I closed the door behind me out of habit or some other reason, and then I realized how dark it was. Weathered newspapers, the type that clung directly to the glass when stained and torn at the edges, were used to decorate the windows. They were unmarried, on the one hand. 1978 to 1991, or 1980 to 1991. Nothing novel, nothing near modern. I set up my supplies by the doorway, a folding chair, gloves, wipes, a broom, and my Bluetooth speaker. To kill time, dress silly and carefree. It was easy work. Clear surfaces of cobwebs and dust to create the appearance of human presence. No heavy lifting or thorough cleaning is necessary. I started by looking around the living room. The crushed velvet couch's cushions have all been taken out. A brick hearth piled high with ash from previous years infuriated him. Behind it, a warped mirror was propped up against the wall, maybe for a few seconds. Now its reflection was wrong. Everything in it looked a little off, as though it had been put half a second behind schedule. I detested working in the kitchen. Household appliances, since I am completely incapable of recognizing them. Their coiled cords had the feel of a dead serpent. There was a strong, foul smell coming from the refrigerator, even though it was not turned on. Nevertheless, with a rag still over my face, I opened it. What I saw did not live up to my expectations. It was not just an unpleasant interior. Wide black lines were streaked on the back panel. 5 deep gouges, evenly spaced, appear on the inside of the door as though someone had dug their hand down firmly in an attempt to get out. I became paralyzed. I held the marks at a slight angle with my fingers. I didn't want to touch. They appeared fresh. Just 5 clean, sharp grooves. No fading or rust at all. I pulled away and slammed the door. I simply needed a moment to gather my thoughts. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to leave just yet. That amount was important. To tell the truth, I was worried about appearing stupid for being afraid of a refrigerator. My next destination was the pantry. Fortunately, it was empty. Then there's an empty room with a fallen bookcase and a little plastic chair in front of it, as though someone had tried to teach a child there once before. This chair had the appearance of something from a preschool. Pink, cracked, still standing. The last thing I did was go up the stairs. That's because I didn't want to climb. I did this by acting as though I hadn't noticed they were gone. By the time I realized I had no choice, My speaker had already died. Not stalled, but dead. Total quiet. It was already full when I got there. My phone showed 68%, but no matter what I did, it would not connect. No data, Bluetooth, or anything else. I grabbed it out of its hands and grabbed the broom. It was a steep climb up the small staircase. No railing, just weathered wood. With each step I took, the ground felt like it was giving way beneath me. 3 entrances were located at the very top. 1 half closed and 2 open. Bed frame in the first room, rusty and vacant. Opening into the room from the closet. Above the window, you could see tiny fissures in the wall that curved like veins. An internal punch appeared to have pierced the wall. Nursery, second room, worn wallpaper. It was a dreary day for ducks, suns, and rainbows. Crib in the corner, with one leg severely twisted to the side. I peeked in, even though I didn't want to. Bones, dust, and splinters. Nothing. Just one more door to close. I used the broom to gently push it open. Complete silence. All it did was swing inward. The space had no furnishings. An oval-shaped, worn-out rug sits in the center. A solitary crimson fingerprint on the wall atop it. That was just too ideal. Just one smooth, open hand, no spills or smears. I extended out my finger and pressed it down like a stamp. For what seemed like an eternity, I just stared at it. Reasoned that it was just paint. It was unbelievable to me. Instead of cleaning the upstairs hallway or dusting the railing, I retreated to the basement, grabbed the broom, and sat on the floor until what seemed like late afternoon. I didn't even bother to dust the railing. I reasoned that the real estate agent could phone to inquire as to my early departure. It was important to me not to lie. Again, I was reluctant to elaborate. I should have known better. In the midst of it all, I fell asleep, I don't know, for a moment or two. All I could see when I opened my eyes was pitch black. Before the sun goes set. Totally black. Overwhelming darkness. As if the world were doused in ink. Silence. Emanating from the glass. My phone's LED light isn't working. Nothing at all. I snatched my phone and gave it a quick tap. Totally lifeless. Every muscle in my body tensed as I slowly sat up. Damn, I'm in pain. The home was dead silent, the kind of tranquility that makes you feel seen. There are no sounds of water or settling boards. Up above me, I suddenly heard a thud. There was a single, crisp, solid sound, as if something huge had fallen on the nursery floor, but there was no crash or thud. I remained motionless and unblinking, holding my breath the whole time. I got to my feet, retrieved my luggage, and made my way to the door, where I staggered and failed to open it. The door remained jammed even after turning the knob. 3 times I pushed harder. It gave way on my 3rd attempt, and I was on the verge of falling out into the porch. Even though my arms were covered with goosebumps, the night air hit me hot. After running a mile, my breath caught. I rushed to the car, hopped in, and tried to start it, but it didn't work. On 3 separate occasions. At the sound of the engine's rumble, the porch light went out. Upon my arrival, it was not turned on. Nothing had escaped my grasp. Though it had lost all power, it was now steady, pale and shining. Glanced at it through the porch light. On the 2nd story, in the center of the window, there is a figure standing precisely over the rug, its features absent. It watches. After nearly ripping the bumper off, I slammed on the brakes and backed into a fence post. Kept going till I finally reached pavement. I should have contacted the real estate agent sooner. The key was never returned. I put it in the glove compartment. My family and I moved into that old house on the hill outside of Benton Hollow when I was 12 years old, according to Story 6. Once again, we were preparing to move because my dad had secured a renovation contract. We made short trips everywhere. As soon as he completed one job, we moved on to the next. His excuse was that it was only a one-time project. However, by that summer, I had completely forgotten the number of places we had resided. This mansion, however, was unique. Perched on a hilltop, far from any other houses in the area, it stood alone at the end of a twisting gravel road. After winding its way through dense underbrush, the driveway eventually gave way to a two-story Victorian that appeared to have been neglected over the years. The paint was flaking and chipped, as if it had struggled to maintain its integrity but ultimately failed. It appeared as though the porch was exhaling since one side drooped so significantly. A sense of anticipation pervaded the entire establishment. There was an interior, tiny stairway with a handrail that looked more ornamental than functional. Considering the layout of the house, the upstairs halls were unusually lengthy. The number of doors and corners was excessive. Every time someone walked through it, the air seemed as if it had narrowly avoided being touched. Built into the wall of the kitchen was a dumb waiter. The sensation that something could be peering back at it persisted with each glance. I was out of school that summer. Since my mom was my teacher, I spent a lot of time in the kitchen or cleaning rooms reading or working through old textbooks as she homeschooled me. It was silent, but not terrible. Nobody in town knew us. We had half a mile to go down the hill to reach our closest neighbor. On most days, Mom would forego even starting the automobile. We had an ample supply of dry groceries and canned items to last for weeks. It wasn't until dinner time that Dad returned home. He left before morning. For the most part, it was just my mom and myself. Mr. Calloway was the owner of the house. A lonely man in his 70s or older, he resided in a cottage with just one floor at the foot of the hill. Upon our arrival, he presented us with the keys in an unusually formal manner, as if he were merely performing a formality. According to him, his family had lived in the residence for many years. Mom gave me the "don't press it" look and just responded, "easier to take care of," when I inquired why he would leave such a large property for something so little. There was a complete absence of activity during the initial week. Although the floorboards were ancient and uneven, they made a creaking sound. The porch swing would occasionally bang against the siding due to the wind. Mice in the walls might occasionally be heard by me. Just a run-down mansion carrying out its rundown duties. Upstairs, I would spend most days either reading or aimlessly exploring the house in the vain hope of discovering a hidden drawer or secret tunnel. Completely unnerving, simply dull. Next, the dishes were done. It was in the late afternoon on a Thursday. Thursdays always include watching the same TV show, so that's why I remember. As my mom prepared supper, I hid under the parlor's cover with a bowl of popcorn. Like someone had dropped a plate stack, this clattering sound abruptly and sharply broke through the ambient sounds. Running to the kitchen, I leaped to my feet. The mother was standing there already. She didn't change her expression. Every cabinet was open. Every possible dish, bowl, and cup, even the cheapest plastic ones, were visible on the counter. They were all upside down, as though someone had laid them out in a grid for analysis. She turned to me and spoke in a low, strained voice. "Why did you take out each dish? We own the property." I just stared at her, to be honest. Not me. She didn't say anything, missing the point. I began to store them gradually. She was extremely careful, as though something were going to snap. After I helped her, we didn't speak. The silence between us was more stifling than the clamor that had preceded it. After that, stranger things started to occur. It's strange, but not in a scary way. It will cause you to reevaluate your preconceptions. 3 days later, we reconnected. We were sitting on the couch, watching a dull show, when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Slowly, one by one. She switched off the TV. The sound continued. One technique after another. It stopped at the very top of the stairs. We both waited for a while. Mom finally got up and walked up the stairs. I was only a short distance behind. The hallway was empty. All the doors had been shut. Every component fits flawlessly. But there was a deafening silence, as though something had simply ceased to move and was trying to be heard. Then it kept happening. Footsteps, drawers that open on their own, a door to a cabinet that swings ever so slightly, and a fork in the floor. One morning I woke up to find the books on the parlor shelf all piled neatly on the floor. It simply shifted, and everything was okay. Dad didn't say much. He might shrug or crack a joke. There are some homes that seem very old. Raccoons might be able to open cabinets with enough practice and time. He doesn't seem to care. That might have been the problem. The worst day came next. Mom had gone grocery shopping in town. I sat down with my Game Boy on the parlor floor and tried to get past a level that had been stumping me for days. There was no radio or television, only the soft sound of buttons being pressed and the strange creak coming from the house. Then I heard it, going up the stairs. This is no place for laziness. They had to go through the stairs. I became paralyzed. My fingers froze on the buttons as I froze. I waited, hoping it would end. No, it didn't. Proceed. The subsequent phase. The boards were under a lot of pressure. Proceed. One more. They were about to descend. My entire body went cold. I was surprised. I waited for the next step. A piece of me exploded when it arrived. I took off running. No shoes and a Game Boy. I ran out the front door, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I reached the bottom of the hill. My legs were as hard as rubber, and my lungs were burning. I walked away from them. I sat with my knees and my arms on the side of the road as the hours went by. When my mother's car finally came up the gravel driveway, I didn't wave. I just stood there while she parked. I waited outside until she did. The strangeness faded after that, but never returned. A fork is absent. The door, once closed, is now open. The drag of a chair is visible on the floor. The sound of footsteps upstairs was so loud that we stopped, soundly sleeping. I wouldn't go up the stairs by myself. Dad is unmoved. Mom asked Mr. Stir Calloway when we were about 2 weeks away from moving out. Get right to the point and avoid the small talk. Had anything unusual ever happened in the house? It took him a long time to speak. Then he told us about his sister, June. When she was 17, she was attacked while returning home from a friend's house. Although she survived, she changed, became unusually silent, and never left her house. She was hanging from the beam over the stove when he went back to the kitchen a year later. His family began to drift apart after that. His father had changed. His mother began sitting on the top step of the stairs and looking down the hall as part of her nightly routine. June claimed to hear someone whispering in addition to her own voice, a man's voice, too low, as though he didn't want to wake anyone. She said that was her son's voice. "Mister," she heard her son say. He was constantly in bed when she made her claims, but he was Calloway's. He didn't believe her at first. He also said he heard it when he was living alone in the house years later after his parents left. There's a low, solid bass and a soft, feminine tone to the conversations going on upstairs behind closed doors. Then he went into the cabin. We packed up and departed shortly after that. I never came back. I didn't even drive by the place. The seventh story is set at a farmhouse my husband and I bought when I was 27 years old in Elmer County, Tennessee. Located at the end of a narrow gravel road that branched off from Highway 12, it appeared to have been an afterthought. No way on anyone's morning commute to work. The road came to a sudden halt as it vanished into a dense forest where the trees appeared to have been bound together by a natural force. Given its remote location, the land was surprisingly cheap, almost suspiciously so. I was encouraged that the porch was still upright. It was uninspired, but it did not convey a sense of impending disaster. We were impetuous, young, and tired of paying rent, so forget about it. So we bought it. Without giving us the creeps, our real estate agent gave us just enough background information to spark our curiosity. It belonged to the old widow who passed away by herself, she said. Her house has been empty for years with no one to share it with except the occasional neighbor who comes to mow the yard. Who among us wouldn't follow that course? By not doing so, we lost a chance to ask more questions. My husband's new night shift at the Bartonville Logistics Hub meant that our nights were now separated. I worked shifts at a nearby feed store during the day and was usually left alone at home at night. I didn't mind if it didn't say anything. I do best alone. We were joined by Theo and Fern, our feline companions. They quickly adapted. The house was drafty but sturdy. Wide plank flooring, strong hardwood beams, and remnants of a time when building was done with long-term survival in mind. On the weekends, we replaced the rusty fixtures with gleaming brass ones and painted the walls an off-white that gave the space a feeling of lightness. One morning, maybe a month in, I stumbled into the barn and saw a small black kitten crouched over some rotting lumber, scared and covered in dust. I held out my hand, and she hopped in there in 2 seconds. It turned out to be Cricket. There was a kink halfway down her tail. The healing process was obviously wrong. Despite this, she had a commanding presence. She followed me everywhere, acting as though she had lived here all along. Then, the subtleties began. I would occasionally hear what sounded like someone's fingernail tapping on the wood while I was in the spare bedroom sorting through my laundry. In the late evening, on time. Observing the dining room, which we had transformed from the parlor, through the back window all the time. There was never any benefit to stopping, listening, or going outside with a flashlight. There was only silence, no animals, no branches. I reminded myself that it was just the house settling, the old wood shifting, the pipes groaning from temperature changes. But after that, Cricket started acting oddly. One night while I was doing the dishes, she froze, sat stiffly on her back legs, and growled softly. There was no meowing or hissing, just a deep, guttural growl. The dish towel dropped to the ground. She stood still, staring at the dining room door. Then the knocking began, not from outside, but from inside the wall. 3 measured taps came from the other side of the dining room. Subtle but difficult to overlook. My heart pounded. I stepped into the room and pressed my palm against the plaster. I tapped once. There was a pause. Then there were 2 slow, deliberate knocks behind the wall. I tapped again in different locations. At the pause, 2 and 1 levels. Just 1. The wall responded precisely. Cricket mumbled something softly and stayed still, staring at the same piece of wall. I was afraid to argue. I got my keys and drove to my husband's workplace. I explained the taps to him, the cricket's response, the way the wall had pushed back. He took it very seriously. "I'll check every space when I get home," he promised her, and he did. There are no nests, holes, or hiding places. Just old dust in the crawl space, attic, porch, or closets. But it continued. The next night, it happened again. More adamant. A cricket scuttled under the couch. Fern and Theo ran. I stayed in the living room until morning, with all the doors locked and the lights on. That's when I called my mom. Her house is 3 hours away from Cooper Lake. I needed help badly, even though I knew it sounded scary. She listened, then said, "Burn cedar. Crack a window while you do it. If you see something, don't run. Talk to it. Use its name if you know it." Cricket had no name to give it, and I didn't know what it was. For the next week, I refused to be alone. I worried from a diner booth. At night, I sat in the truck outside my husband's job. The cats refused to enter the dining room. Even in daylight, they glared at that wall. Finally, my parents visited. My mom paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the room before stepping in. That night, she asked to sleep in the guest room above the dining room. She didn't explain. She waited 3 nights. On the 3rd night, she said, "It's time." We had to promise not to talk about what happened for 3 days afterwards. We agreed. She lit a bundle of cedar tied with red string and went room to room, humming softly. She circled every doorway 3 times. When she reached the dining room, she paused. Then it happened. A clang of metal like something thrown against steel came from behind the piano. The floor seemed to throb. I jumped. My mom didn't stop. She finished in under an hour, dropped the cedar into water and said nothing. For 3 days, silence. The cats relaxed. I slept. On day 4, I asked, "What did you see?" She claimed that 2 spirits were tied to the property. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, lived by the tree line near the barn. She could see him watching upstairs. He threw pebbles at the glass, hoping to catch someone's eye. When she asked who he was looking for, he said, My friend. I need to talk to him before he did it." She realized the boy didn't know he died. He was stuck reliving that last day. She told him the truth. She helped him move on. The second presence was older. A man who once lived in the house, loved it, died there and stayed. He wasn't angry, just persistent. He'd been the one knocking, not to scare me, but to say I existed. "I'm still here." She told him he could stay, but only peacefully. No more knocking, no more fear. I wanted more details, so I went to the nearest neighbor, Harris, and asked about the last residence. He said a father and son had lived there. The son, Levi, was my age when it happened. When I asked what happened, Harris hesitated. Then he said Levi had taken his own life in the old shed one winter. His father found him. After that, the father never left the house until he died. I asked if Levi had a close friend. Harris nodded. "Yeah, boy named Eli. They were inseparable." Months later, there was a knock on our door. A man in his 30s, quiet and soft-spoken, asked if he could see the house. He was Eli. He continued, softly making his way to the dining room wall and pausing at the piano. "Levi used to knock here. That was our signal. We let him in," he said. Before opening once, the door swung open twice. Entering is safe. Without asking what we had heard, he kept walking upstairs to the guest room. He stood at the window most of the time. Levi used to hurl pebbles at this glass whenever I was late. If I didn't come right away, he would knock. Always the same pattern. He thanked her and left. Paragraph 8. The house lay about 3 miles outside the little Kentucky town of Linwood, which was scarcely worth a visit. One gas station, one cafe with a sagging neon sign. It was there. It would take less than 5 minutes to drive through, assuming you could avoid getting stuck behind a farm truck. The listing had been live for months. White paint peeled off in long, curling strands. The porch sagged as though it were straining to stay upright, as though it were trying to let out a slow, weary sigh. With every look, the asking price appeared to be decreasing. These kinds of ads frequently hinted at trouble. Locals whispered about it at the bait store and feed mill. The location again. Despite my lack of superstition, someone would always say, "Good luck with that." I thought they were just shy individuals. Trouble meant haunted anyhow, but haunted could mean bargain. I signed the documents in early March. It's a fresh spring weekend. Flaking paint and overgrown grass were the only obstacles in my path, not to mention a project that I might even take on or possibly salvage. I convinced myself that a week would be more than enough. Fix the flooring as needed, clean the area, and maybe even sleep there. One night I gathered toolboxes, bean cans, and chili. Nothing fancy, just the essentials, in addition to my sleeping bag and water bottle. I didn't want to make the daily commute into town. On that drive, I wasn't ready to commit to that level of commitment. The air feels strange and stagnant, as if the house has been holding its breath for a long time. It's stale and dry, but not bad. You may taste a flavor on the tongue. I only unpacked a few toolboxes on my own. I wanted to look at the skeleton first. I started by looking at the kitchen floor. I scrubbed so hard that I felt my arms being pulled. The type of cleaning that gives the impression that the fabric has been soiled by unseen filth. Then, as if the floorboards were letting out a small sigh, the transformation took place upstairs. I paused to listen while holding a sponge. Old houses do that, I told myself as I settled in, but the second incident took place in the same spot, with the same faint groan. I chose to ignore the cold. After the third time, I gave up cleaning. My chest thumped as my heart raced. The tone and the familiar pattern made me feel like I was in one of those "listen to this on headphones for maximum creep" videos. I stayed still and breathed slowly, thinking it might be dust or drywall, but nothing else happened. There was silence in the old kitchen. I wouldn't sleep upstairs. I reconsidered because the boards were twisted. I set up shop in the bedroom downstairs. After unfolding the sleeping bag and placing the toolboxes in a corner, the door was shut. I had established some territory, but I felt foolish. The first night got off to a rough start. A knuckles firm hold on the floor at around midnight woke me up from my sleep. As if someone were testing it, it came on quickly. I balled my fist around the bed. "Keep your composure." I lay still, breathing normally. For 2 minutes, I waited. There was another tap. The same location. I was surprised that I didn't move. I was surprised. Finally, I struggled out of the bag and crawled to the door. Walking barefoot on the cold wood, bringing a flashlight. Cola stepped outside. I peered through the upper floor windows. Nearly all of them were black. Above my bedroom, my beam struck it squarely, shine brightly. Flash. Lost. No numerical value is present. Nothing but my light reflected in an old black glass mirror. I blamed my lack of sleep on anxiety. I swept and moved debris on the second day. I continued to play country music in the kitchen and on the radio to fill the silence. However, things deteriorated at night. Now goes beyond simple taps. A heavy, slow-moving sound, like furniture being moved inch by inch, is heard, along with faint thuds. I intended to start working on it as soon as I woke up. I had no intention of climbing those steps. That's when my tools began to wander. I had left the hammer on the kitchen counter, and it was now resting on the front steps, neatly pressed up against the door. I had hidden a box of nails by the back door, and now it was sitting on the upper floor landing. I hadn't walked up there in 2 days. I told myself I must have carried it up without realizing it, but every nerve in my body was telling me otherwise. I developed a stronger habit of doing outdoor daytime tasks like picking leaves and nail clipping. In the last of the afternoon light, the place looked almost harmless. However, the nights grew darker and longer. What had been thuds became deliberate, purposeful footsteps on the second night. One stream after another, getting closer to the stairway. I held my breath. I felt empty in my lower body. The noise stopped suddenly before it reached the stairs. Then there was a stillness, not the peaceful kind, but a muted, oppressive one. There was a single hum from the refrigerator, followed by silence. The air was humid even though it was sunny. I tried pressing my palms against my legs to get them to move. Then there was a slow, soft scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the wood. At last, the drag reverberated for what seemed like an eternity, with a heavy, loud thud that shook the light fixture in the hallway. It swayed slightly. There was utter quiet. The weary swaying of that light was the only sound. The pry bar dropped to the ground. Whoa! On the floor, it clattered. Then I ran for the door. I kept going until I succeeded. My truck's door was slammed shut. I looked back once as the uneven yard was illuminated by headlights. I had sealed the same upstairs window the day I got there, and it was ajar. I never intended to approach the location, much less enter it. Story 9. But my friend Mark suggested me to a local realtor who needed someone with a camera and some schedule flexibility. Despite his polite manner, real estate agent Colby appeared nervous over the phone. He said the house belonged to a deceased man. Despite not having a will, family, or supporting documentation, we have a loan. They plan to sell it at auction now that the county had legal ownership of it. First, they require interior photos for legal purposes. Colby made it clear that he had no intention of going upstairs. He said he tried it once and was not impressed. That was the end of his explanation. I thought it was all rhetoric. I've encountered at least one rural real estate broker who makes it seem as though every cabin and barn is doomed for dramatic effect. However, his offer was double what I usually charge. After spending a few hours inside, taking broad shots of every space, and uploading some files to Dropbox, I was ready to go. Seemed simple. Yes, I replied. The house was in the middle of a huge field about 15 minutes from any major road, and there were no neighbors to be seen. There were no other houses or barns or fences, just grass and dirt and this drooping structure in the center, as if something had just fallen there. From a distance, it looked like someone without the right tools or sense of proportion had joined 5 different structures. Parts wobbled. There were discordant roof lines. 3 different types of weathered wood were among them: dents, slats, and what looked like mildew growing on what might have been green aluminum. This was something that stayed with me even before things started to get weird. The street was not facing the front door by a large amount. The house opened toward a level patch of grass, as though it had turned around and everyone had simply left it that way. When I got there, someone was already waiting. "Please, Ellis." Not at all with the realtor. It was just a man Colby had me use to open the door and watch over my things while I was away. Interestingly, in retrospect, it doesn't appear that there was anything valuable to steal from that place. Ellis seemed to be the kind of guy who took odd jobs to avoid making conversation. Tall, stubby, stubble gray, 90s scorching denim jacket. He didn't say anything when I got close. Without looking inside, I unlocked the door. I only needed to nod for the keys to jingle warningly. Then he walked over to his truck and sat on the hood. When I said, "Not unless someone pays me triple," he replied, "You're not coming in?" And I went into the room by myself. I felt the air first. It hadn't gone bad like other abandoned places. There was no mustiness or decay, and it was dense and solid, as though it had been trapped inside the walls for a long time. There was no dust, and I felt cold, a sense of peace that made my arms stand on end. The front room was in ruins, not from damage, but from confusion. A couch, 2 chairs, and a lamp without a shade were crammed against one wall, giving the impression that it was a record cabinet. Everything was back where it had been, like someone preparing for a flood. I experimented with the settings and took a few pictures as if it were any other task. The chamber that followed was even worse. 2 crowded tables, one round and one rectangular, are present in the dining room. No seats are available. The wall is decorated with one slightly crooked painting, a landscape, but the artist's brushstrokes seemed angry, as though they had stopped in the middle. I persevered through it all. Some of the doors actually led somewhere, but most of them just opened into small hallways. 2 lead to walls that are empty. 1 opened into what appeared to be a pantry-like closet, dark and shelfless. After recording everything, I later found the hallway. That one was special. Extending the duration, it was clearly 40 or 45 feet too long for the house's footprint. That side of the house was only 30 feet deep when viewed from the outside. But the corridor didn't care. The narrow, plain hallway ended at a single locked door. I walked to it with barely audible footsteps and unlocked it. There were no windows in the room, just an iron bed frame against the distant wall. There was no mattress, but there were footprints on the floor, suggesting that one had been there at one point. It was cooler but not any fresher, like being in a cellar with deteriorating insulation. There was another entrance just across the room. I thought it led to a closet or a bedroom off to the side. No, it didn't. It opened into another hallway. The length of every creak on the ground is the same. The overhead fixture has a constant slight slant. I turned around and headed back. The room behind me had remained unchanged. I took the appropriate action. Door after door, corridor after corridor. By the 3rd or 4th, I knew it wasn't a loop. I went deeper and deeper. There were slight but discernible changes. A light switch that is a little tilted. I stepped on a floorboard that was twisted. Recently cracked drywall. I tried to turn around and go back, but I froze. The one in front of me looked like a hallway, as did the one behind me. Markers and shifts are absent. I decided on a course and started walking. The changes were apparent by the 6th corridor. A hand warmer, rather than the sun, made a doorknob feel warm. My palm touched its surface, causing a sudden release of heat. I listened for a long time. Null and void. The wind has ceased. No tracks can be found. There are no waterways in the walls. When I used the 7th door, I was immediately transported back to that bedroom. It seemed the same, though. The frame and floor are the same. Regretfully, I had left my camera bag on the bed earlier and couldn't find it. It had been replaced by another camera, an older one, heavier and covered in dust. Additionally, one partially removed picture protruded from the back of the slot. I extracted it. It was a photograph of me standing exactly where I was at that moment, looking over my left shoulder from behind. I didn't flip it, didn't bother to see if anything had been typed. My legs felt like elastic bands, as if I had been running on air. Without thinking twice, I threw the camera to the ground and rushed to the door. This time, however, it did not lead to another corridor. The front door was where it ended. The front door stood open. Ellis continued to stand in the field, one hand clutching my camera bag. He waited in utter silence. Without a word, he just held out the bag. My GPS came back 10 miles later, so I got into my car, nodded, and stopped looking at the map. Story 10. When I was 29, I offered to stay overnight at a historic estate in Kentucky. I was technically in charge of handling the nightly shift, while the regular crew was away. It looked simple enough. Locate a few keys, go around, and record anything unusual. That night, it seemed like a dumb first move. Please unlock the back parlor to gain access to the caretaker tour. No issue, I thought. I walked in casually. It was called Holloway. Holloway, not Ridge House or Holly Place. Not very charming. Imagine a simple house from the early 1800s, surrounded by hazy blue ridges. The kind that appears to have been carved out of the mountainside and is now positioned to watch over the valley below. I had a walkie-talkie, a flashlight, a clipboard, and a sketch of the floor plan. I didn't need anything else, at least in my head. From the moment I walked through the door, everything seemed slightly strange. Not alarm screech strange, but that low-frequency strain that stays in your bones when something doesn't fit. My first thought was to turn right and go toward the library down the hallway, but I quickly realized that was not going to happen. The wall formed a sufficiently gentle curve. I wondered if it was all in my head when I suddenly found myself heading toward a pantry. Not that, the library. I stared at the printed floor plan as I stood still in the foyer. Was what I had memorized wrong? No, that corridor should not have been included. I brushed it off with a faint smile. An old house will behave strangely when you walk on it. Every room had that heavy, ancient-tasting air, like sealed wood. Everything was covered in debris. I breathed it in, the threads resting on my tongue and adhering to the back of my throat. I was anticipating distant noises, such as the sound of footsteps or the creaking of floorboards or the babbling of brooks. But nothing was discovered. There is only wrongness, not phantom laughing or other disembodied speech. Faint, heavy discomfort that seemed to seep deeper into my ribs with every conscious breath. On the first night, I opened that back parlor and went up the main stairs to see how the back windows were doing. Everyday items. However, one of the risers sank a little under my foot halfway up. I hesitated, reached out, and touched it firmly. I shrugged and carried on, using my flashlight's beam to cut through the darkness. Then it blinked once, stuttering, as though it were a lazy, fake blink. I felt nauseous. The top of the landing is adorned with a large photograph of a woman wearing a gown from that era, her hairstyle and expression captured in time. I was reluctant to look at it, but I did. Later, when the beam from my flashlight was more steady, I looked again. Her expression had changed. It was only a partial motion, but it made me pause and reflect. I was surprised. I didn't understand anything else. The second evening, the pantry light went out while I was looking around the kitchen for a missing pan. I had left the ceiling light bulb on high. The flick of a switch must have brought darkness. Though short, it was just the right amount of time to ease my anxiety. There was a whisper in my mind, maybe a sibilant pattern of sound that surrounded me, but it wasn't words or deliberate, soft breathing. My heart pounded. I flinched, causing a broom to fall over and metal to grind on the floor. Again, I don't remember putting it up. By the third night, I was recording everything in a logbook. Not particularly noteworthy. I thought I saw patterns and timestamps in my imagination. Then something even bolder happened. There was a jar in the basement that looked like a locked door. I locked it by latching it from the inside each time I climbed up. It was, for once, reachable. I swear, I didn't touch it. I dropped a pen inside the frame and left a marker as proof that I saw it. When I returned later, it was in a different location. It was sitting upright on the handle from the inside. That is simply unthinkable. What a risky position. My eyes didn't move. There was no one else. Later, the pin was found in the wine cellar. I had only ventured to look into another chamber. It looked as if it had been placed on a shelf and left there. I stood up, feeling a strange thrill. Okay, I thought, the game has already started. The fourth evening. I make changes to my journal entry. Nothing unusual, aside from times, lights, creaks, and dry entry. I then received a new line in my flawless handwriting. Watch her. I frowned, because I didn't think of that. I intend to remember. The words hit my ear like a cold sigh. On the fifth night, I tried to leave early. There won't be any drama. I just need to get out of work, open the front door, get into my car, and leave. But there was no front door. Only brick. Sturdy brick. Dust, hangers, and just the wall. I pressed my palm against it while my heart was pounding, and either I pulsed into the wall or the wall pulsed a little. I couldn't tell either. I was terrified. Swiftly climbed up and checked the parlor windows. The outside world is deserted. The words hit my ear like a cold sigh. On the fifth night, I tried to leave early. There won't be any drama. I just need to get out of work, open the front door, get into my car, and leave. But there was no front door, only brick, sturdy brick, dust, hangers, and just the wall. I pressed my palm against it while my heart was pounding, and either I pulsed into the wall or the wall pulsed a little. I couldn't tell either. I was terrified. Swiftly climbed up and checked the parlor windows. The outside world is deserted. There was only flat, endless nothingness. No undulating hills, no velvety dark sky. I looked with trembling hands. My walkie-talkie suddenly began crackling through the static. My voice came through, looping and hissing, repeated door after door. I didn't touch it. I stood there in a daze, trying to identify which side of my mouth was producing the sound as the signal faded into static. Day 6. I swallowed any final protest and went back to the basement. Like a moth to a light bulb, I was enthralled. The hinge of the door swung loosely. I pushed it inward. My bones were rattled by a low-volume buzz that filled the stairwell. I followed it past the storage containers and furnace and into an unidentified corner. Stone walls are dampened by condensation. Behind an ancient boiler set into the stonework was a tiny alcove no bigger than a shoebox. Deep inside was a leather-bound book held together by a frayed cord. My body moved closer. The leather began to crack with time. I still don't understand why I reached in, and my fingers failed me for some reason. They held on loosely. My physical form felt like it belonged to someone else. My confidence waned, and I backed off. I left my logbook open on the hall table. Fluidity of novel writing. Let the house think. Not my slanted handwriting, however. 7th day. I was in the front parlor again. The tape-mended mirror caught my attention. The broken glass was only partially intact, preventing the pieces from falling. I stared at its reflection. The room looked immaculate, drenched in sunlight. The furniture was neatly arranged. There are no bricked walls. All floors are parquet. It was morning, as it should have been. I pressed my finger against the glass, feeling it warmer than it should be, not from sunlight, but from a living source. Then, without thinking about it, I walked in.